Good morning. I'm Jonathan Pollack, the interim SK Korea Foundation Chair in Korea Studies here at the Brookings Institution in the Center for East Asian Policy Studies. I am very, very pleased that this morning, only a few hours after the closing of the polls in the Republic of Korea, we are able to connect to my good friend and professional colleague, David Straub. David, of course, had a 30-year, very distinguished career in the U.S. Foreign Service with multiple tours, both in Korea and Japan. He then spent a number of years at Stanford University in their Asia Pacific Research Center, published an essential book for all of those who want to understand South Korea's tumultuous transition over the last several decades. Called AntiAmericanism in Democratizing South Korea. This is a book that should be read by anyone interested in the future of U.S.-Korea relations. And I suspect in the aftermath of the election, it will have a new audience yet again. David is now serving as the LS Sejong Fellow or is it the Sejong LS Fellow at the Sejong Institute, leading private think tank in Seoul. And we're delighted to have him with us in the immediate aftermath of the election to provide us important insights on the ground. So, David, welcome and good evening. You are our on-the-ground correspondent tonight. We're delighted to have you here.
Good morning, Jonathan. It's a great pleasure.
David, this is an unprecedented election in many ways. It follows in the aftermath, of course, of the impeachment and dismissal of Park Geun-hye, the president of the Republic of Korea, following all kinds of controversies that we might end up discussing to some extent. She's the first president ousted through this kind of a process. So this was a snap election. She did not complete her 5-year term as president of South Korea. With the snap election, we now have, clearly from the exit polls, a new president in the Republic of Korea, Moon Jae-in, representing the Democratic Party. Moon, of course, was the candidate against Park Geun-hye in 2012, but he is now, when he came in second, but now he has come in first, and he is the new president of Korea. We don't have the official final results. That'll be a few hours yet off, where he will be certified. But the other thing that then makes this an unprecedented election is, unlike past procedures, he will assume power immediately in South Korea. He will be sworn in as the next president sometime on Wednesday, and the ball is in his hands. The question will be how he governs and how South Korea proceeds at a very, very tumultuous time, both on the Korean Peninsula and on a broader international scale. But David, I've got some broad questions I'd like to pose to you today, and then we can have a discussion. The first just begins with how we look at the results as we know them to this point, even though the final numbers are not quite in yet.
Yes, the polls closed here just over 2 hours ago, Jonathan, and the broadcast networks did an exit poll of about 80,000 people, so we can be fairly confident that the numbers will hold up. And the results are basically about 41% for candidate Moon Jae-in, 23% for the Conservative Party candidate, Mr. Hong, and about 22% for the centrist candidate, An Chol-soo of the People's Party. So again, those will probably hold up. In fact, now, even though we've only counted about 15% of the vote nationwide, KBS, based on its computer algorithm, has already called the election for Moon. Moon has already given a discreet initial acceptance speech. He had to be careful because he's not officially declared the winner yet. And in fact, his two major opponents, Hong and An, have also given de facto speeches or remarks accepting the results of the election.
what can we say about the breakdown regionally and so forth in terms of his level of support? And what can we say equally important about the generational splits, the age cohort splits? Do we have enough data, at least from the exit polls, to draw some conclusions?
Yes, on both counts. This time, it looks like Mr. Moon has won virtually the entire country, again, by pluralities rather than, in most cases, outright majorities. But the only places that he does not appear likely to win is the traditional stronghold, conservative stronghold of North Gyeongsang Province and Daegu. However, it's still possible that he lost those to the conservative candidate, Mr. Hong, apparently. It's still a little close in South Gyeongsang and also perhaps in Gangwon. So we'll have to watch this a little closer. But overall, Mr. Moon has won almost the entire nation. But again, by plurality, and the surprise here is that Mr. Moon, the conservative candidate, was able to come up so quickly and get as far as he did. Now, in terms of the generational split, that's also very interesting. KBS has done a very good breakdown of that already for its viewers here. Mr. Moon won a plurality of all of the age cohorts except for the over 60, and of those, 48% have apparently voted for Mr. Hong. Only 23% or so for Mr. Moon. The 50s were also leaning conservative. 26 or 7% of those supported Mr. Hong. About 37%, however, supported Mr. Moon.
You know, it's important to note, of course, the fact that he has been elected by a plurality and not a majority is hardly unprecedented. Indeed, since the direct presidential system was introduced in Korea, I guess in the late 1980s, only one candidate has ever won an outright majority. And that, of course, is the now disgraced and dismissed Park Geun-hye, who won a little over 51% of the votes. So it tells us something, that there have been lots of other presidents before President-elect Moon who have ruled and have had to try to find a way to advance their own agenda and so forth in the absence of a clear majority. But I would say, and maybe we'll proceed first to a sense of the political landscape and then go back to what we know about President-elect Moon. But you know, he faces a situation where, although Minju, his party, the Democratic Party, is the largest of the parties in the National Assembly, it is far from a majority. How do those numbers break down?
Yes, this is a very important factor for governance in South Korea under President Moon. The National Assembly has a total of 299 seats, but as in our Senate, it takes a supermajority of about 60% or about 180 votes to be able to pass major legislation there. Mr. Moon's Democratic Party has only 119 seats, and so this sets up a situation in which other parties are going to have to join him if he's going to be able to pass legislation, including the conservative, at least some members of the Conservative Party. This is a problem, of course, we know very well in the United States, of legislative gridlock. South Korea has had it for many years now. President Park was terribly frustrated because the opposition was determined not to pass anything she wanted to, including on her economic reform policy. So I think it will be very interesting to see how Mr. Moon tries to deal with this situation. I suspect that he will try to pull off some of the members of An's party, the People's Party, which is based in the traditional opposition stronghold of Honam, or the Cholo provinces, which used to be President Kim Dae-jung's base. But again, even if he gets all of those, he's still short. So this is going to be very difficult for him.
Yes. It suggests that if we think about this in the context of, you know, the historically intense polarization that exists within South Korea, and in the aftermath of the ouster of President Park, that a lot of the intensity of the events of the last number of months may yet come to play early in his presidency, particularly if he tries to proceed with what we believe to be some of the core items on his policy agenda.
Yes, I think if I had one phrase to characterize this election, I think I would call it the politics of division. Mm-hmm. This country is terribly divided across many different axes. In the last few years, the two major parties, the major conservative party and the major progressive party, were riven by factionalism. And in fact, it was the Democratic Party that split before the Conservative Party. Mr. Moon was left heading what remained of the Progressive Party, and Mr. An took over what used to be President Kim Dae-jung's base in the Cholla provinces. Mm-hmm. So that set up one division within the progressive camp. In the past year or so, the ruling Conservative Party split, and so in this election we also had two conservative candidates running. So there's a great deal of bitterness within both of those camps, the progressive camp on the one hand and the conservative camp on the other. And there's a great deal of bitterness between progressives on the one hand and the conservatives on the other. I mentioned we were talking about the people over 60. They are very, very bitter. They believe that they voted for President Park in large numbers in 2012. I think they identify with her and with her father, who was the president in the 60s and 70s. And they feel that whatever her sins were, that they were not all that different from those of her predecessors. So they feel that she's been treated unfairly.
In terms of pure numbers, if you just choose the 60 and over constituency, is that a larger number of voters than in the other age cohort groups?
I don't recall off the top of my head exactly how what the relative size is, but it's 60 plus, so it's everybody older than 60. I think it's a fairly large cohort, yes.
Well, and historically in many democratic elections, in fact, it is the older voters who tend to turn out in the largest numbers. So that may be another factor.
So that has been important in the past and was a factor in this election, although of course not nearly enough to be decisive. The interesting thing in this election is that the 20-year-olds came out and voted very heavily. I don't have the exact figures off the top of my head, but it was historically a very high vote on the part of the 20-year-olds, and they voted for Mr. Moon.
They voted for Mr. Moon. So, I mean, if we reflect back on the last few months, this extraordinary process of the peaceful demonstrations and then the peaceful legal process through which President Park was impeached, and then the charges were reviewed by special prosecutors and so forth. I mean, at one level, despite the bitterness, it clearly did suggest the operation of a process that was in one respect kind of a bottom-up process in the streets, but then something that proceeded through the necessary steps that in effect made her ouster, even if the conservative forces may resent it, it was a legitimate process in some sense. And so regardless of their frustration and their anger, their feeling that this was excessive, I'm sure one way or another, people have to acknowledge in some measure, at least for now, that there were reasons for this election right now. And given that Moon, despite the divisions in the progressives camp, had a very, very strong base of support, made him the candidate who had enough support to win the competition.
Yes, there's, as I mentioned, Mr. Hong, the conservative candidate, has already de facto acknowledged his defeat and said he accepted the results of this election. And I think he speaks for the great majority of his supporters and the older generation as well. In looking at what's happened over the past few months, of course, you can always look at it as a glass half full or as a glass half empty. In terms of being a glass half full, I think the situation is as you described it. This was a very fraught situation, and it went almost entirely peacefully. And the legal processes and constitutional court processes went through just as the system had been set up to do. On the other hand, when you impeach a president, it means that somewhere along the line, the voters made the wrong decision. And the other thing is that leaves a bitterness on the part of those who feel that it was excessive. And we do have that now in South Korea. So yes, it's very good on the one hand that it was done peacefully, but in an ideal world, we would not have gotten to this point.
It raises an interesting question, David, which may tell us a lot about how Moon seeks to govern, is that, of course, former President Park is now embroiled in a whole criminal process that will determine what happens to her, whether she has to serve a prison sentence and so forth, which is really quite extraordinary if you think about the fact that she is the daughter of Park Geun-hye, and that only in 2012 she was elected with a majority vote and was seen, if anything, as a kind of a more reform-oriented conservative candidate. But political power can be very fleeting, as we know, and political support can be very fleeting. But the immediate question here, though, is whether and how Moon involves himself in the process that is underway now with former President Park. I mean, I'm reminded that, of course, when Kim Dae-jung, the first progressive candidate elected president of the Republic of Korea in 1997, that within 2 days of his victory, he urged President Kim Yong-sam to pardon the two former generals, Chun Doo-hwan and No Tae-woo, who were both serving prison terms at that point. And they indeed were pardoned. So, you know, this will be a judgment call, frankly, on Moon's part. If he wants to try to bridge the divide and draw others into some kind of a notional process of support, he may yet face a decision about what he does about President Park. Is he likely, for example, to let this process just go through the next steps and then make a decision, or what is your sense? I'm not going to hold you to a prediction, but it does seem to me a very, very interesting decision he has to face. This has obviously not arisen in the course of the campaign because it would not have been an appropriate issue during the campaign, but it will tell us something about how he intends to govern.
Well, it's a very good question about a very important issue. Mr. Moon has been calling himself, the candidate of unity. He wants to unify the country after all of these divisive things have happened to it. It was one of the reasons that in the last week or two he was trying to get people to come out, and so that he could get over 50% of the vote, which of course he wound up not getting. Yes, he will have to, one way or the other, make a decision, even if it's a decision not to make a decision about the fate of former President Park. I, of course, have no inside information on this. During the campaign, Mr. Moon was very reluctant to talk about the idea of any sort of pardon or mercy for Ms. Park. The other candidates, major candidates, tended to be a little more forthcoming during the campaign period about what they might do in terms of pardoning her. But I think the reason Mr. Moon took that approach was, of course, he's the candidate representing people who were most avid in their desire to get President Park out of her office. Yeah. So it would not have been very politic for him during the campaign to have been more forthcoming, perhaps, than he was. But so he has to make a decision. My guess, and it's just a guess, is that he will let the prosecution move forward and find her guilty, presumably, and then at that point, or soon after that, then issue a pardon. But that's just a guess. If he does not do that, he will further complicate his governance and will make it harder for him to be the candidate of unity or president of unity that he says he wants to be.
Maybe this is a good point to turn to what we really know about Moon Jae-in in terms of his political history, his personal history, his beliefs with which he enters the presidency. I know there are very different views here. Many people are concerned that he will try to walk back the clock, that it would be Sunshine 2.0, reflecting the priorities undertaken first under Kim Dae-jung and then under Roh Moo-hyun, with whom he was so close over the years. But can you tell us a little about how we should look at Moon as an individual, to the degree that we know a lot about him as an individual?
Yes, he's a very public figure here, of course, having run for president in 2012 and then losing to President Park at that time. He is very similar to his friend and political mentor, the late President Roh Moo-hyun. Both of them grew up in the southeastern corner of the country. Mr. Moon is, I think, 63 years old. His father came during the Korean War from North Korea as a refugee. The family was very poor, Mr. Moon says. Mr. Moon is obviously very smart. He did well in school. He entered university, was arrested for demonstrating, as many bright and ambitious students did in those days, against the dictatorship. He got a law degree, but because of his activism, he was not allowed to get on the judge track, and so served in private practice. And that practice was with Roh Moo-hyun, who was a lawyer defending people activists in cases that the government had brought against them for their political activities. And so they had this lifelong partnership and friendship. And when Mr. Moon, when Mr. Noh became president, he brought Mr. Moon to the Blue House, the South Korean White House, to make him one of his top aides, which he was for the entire time that Noh was in office. I don't think that Mr. Noh is, or Mr. Moon is a born politician, but I think he's learned the trade very well over the past 10 or 15 years. He's articulate, he's intelligent, clearly. He's got political instincts. He knows what to say and what not to say. So he was quite a polished candidate, especially this time around.
Yeah. Would it be fair to say, though, that he exhibits kind of I don't want to call it a measure of caution, but if I'm trying to make comparisons to Roh Moo-hyun, who is, of course, a very controversial figure in Korea's modern political history, Moon does seem to be not as readily identifiable in a way in terms of perhaps what his beliefs may be. He obviously was very loyal to President Noh, but I don't have a clear sense, given the way some of his positions during the campaign leave things a bit ambiguous. I mean, we'll come back to this, the whole question of his attitudes towards the THAAD decision, which of course is a very, very big factor in the U.S.-Korea security relationship and also a factor very much in regional geopolitics. But to pin him down on his exact beliefs here, even though there are strong suspicions that he would prefer not to have THAAD fully deployed, but it's that sense that as a politician, sometimes politicians can be, if they have a natural gift, they can avoid being pinned down in a very precise way. But in this case, I'm not quite as sure. Is it a certain, I don't want to call it a caution that he has, or is it something that he may not really have thought through all of his political moves as he tries to proceed ahead?
Well, I think if we tried to compare him to Roh Moo-hyun, he would look that way. But that's an unfair or a skewed comparison, because, as you know, President Noh was an extraordinarily passionate individual. He he just said many times whatever he felt, and it got him into a great deal of trouble throughout his career and especially as president. So I think in that sense, Mr. Moon is much closer to the mean than Mr. No. And I think that Mr. Moon knew that this was not an election that he could take for granted. And I think he was being cautious in his statements about lots of things because he wanted to make sure that he won. And I don't mean to sound cynical about him. I think if you look back, for example, on North Korea policy, both of his predecessors, President Park and President Lee Myung-bak, as they were candidates, gave the impression that they were right in the middle of the South Korean popular opinion's views of what North Korea policy should be. And of course, they were conservatives, and they weren't in the middle. They were quite to the right of the average South Korean's views on North Korea policy. And that's on North Korea policy. I think Mr. Moon is clearly to the left of a majority of South Koreans, but he has fuzzed that up a bit during their campaign, so to help ensure that he would be elected.
Right. Let's think then a bit, speculate a bit about where he intends to lead South Korea. Let's, for the moment, set aside the international issues and just look at the domestic context, because there's a widespread view, and I think that this is one of the factors that helped elect him, concerns about inequality, lack of opportunity for younger South Koreans, concerns about the longer-term transition in South Korea's economy. As we know, it's been a very, very dynamic force. Remarkable economic growth over the years. It's now either the 11th or 12th biggest economy in the world. And yet a lot of question marks about, what will be the possibilities and prospects, particularly for younger Koreans. Now, Moon, in his campaign, put forward some exceedingly ambitious goals, at least on paper, major public sector hiring, a whole variety of other initiatives. Will those, even as in the United States, there's much more of a focus, understandably, on how Moon will proceed in South Korea's international policies. But in a domestic context, it would seem to me all politicians have to be concerned about how you sustain support in those areas. And how fully could he press ahead in these areas? Or will he simply be inhibited by the fact of the numbers that now prevail in terms of the National Assembly and so forth?
Yes. Well, I would first say that I think the reason he was elected was overwhelmingly that he was not Park Geun-hye. In other words, there was so much popular anger towards Madam Park, and he was the 180-degree opposite candidate in many respects, and that's why he won. Now, that said, I agree with you that the economic situation here and people's livelihood and social concerns is a huge issue in South Korea. And it is, in my recollection, it's always been the biggest factor in terms of issues in South Korean elections, not as many Americans might think, North Korea or something like that. In other words, just like the United States, it's the economy, stupid. Right. And so yes, he has got a big job. South Koreans are notoriously critical of their political leadership, and they chew up and spit out one president after another. And here's a man who has come into office because he's not Park Geun-hye, with only 41 or 2% of the vote, probably, without anything approaching a majority in the assembly. And South Korea has all of these economic...
Did you mean 41% of the vote? I think you said, yeah, right.
Yeah, so South Korea is facing a lot of economic and social problems. Their growth rate is, I think, about 2.8% right now, which is not terrible. But the problem is South Korea its peak working age population has been reached, or will have been reached very, very shortly. And for the next 20 or 30 years, it's going to go down. Moreover, the birth rate continues extremely low. It's basically the lowest in the world at 1.2 children per woman. So this is going to be a problem not only for the economy, but it's going to be a problem for staffing the military and things like that. South Korea is also plagued by competition from China, which is going to become increasingly strong on the one hand, and then from advanced economies on the other. So they feel sandwiched between countries like that. So he's got real obstacles that he has to deal with. Another problem is the services sector in South Korea, which is now quite large but relatively inefficient. But there are lots of vested interest, and nobody has ever really been able to fundamentally fix the services sector.
What can we say about his likely agenda on restraining the power of the chaebol, the major industrial conglomerates that, of course, dominate the South Korean economy? They have obviously been the subject of great controversy, especially in terms of some of the relationships that some of the chaebol had with President Park. There would presumably be popular support for curbing this power, but how does he proceed? What could he do that in some measure addresses these issues without unraveling the essential operation of the Korean economy?
He's made many pledges as to what he's going to do, some specific, some vaguer. He says we need to have more transparency in the management of these major corporations, make it impossible for the family members to own 1 or 2% and through holding companies control entire conglomerates, strengthen boards and other things like that. So I think there's near universal agreement in South Korea and on the part of South Korea's trading partners that would be great if he or somebody else were able to accomplish that. There's been talk of this for a long, long time. There's been some progress, I guess, particularly after the Asian financial crisis at the end of the 1990s under foreign pressure, but it's still not fundamentally resolved. And again, there's going to be a lot of pushback from the conglomerates against some of the things he says he would like to do. And for those things that need legislation, he's going to have to reach across the aisle and get some conservative support if he's going to achieve this. So it will not be easy.
It will not be easy. David, maybe this would be a good point to talk about international issues, although technically, if you think of inter-Korean relations, it's not your classic international issue. It's a divided peninsula and so forth. But Moon has made many statements in the past and during the campaign that indicated that he wants to reverse course here. He wants to go back, at least he says so, to many of the policies that do look very, very similar to those pursued under President No and under President Kim Dae-jung. We're all aware that the inter-Korean relationship now is in a deep freeze for many, many reasons, that many of the steps that were taken under the progressive presidents have now been halted, including, of course, the closing of the Kaesong Industrial Zone, and other broader initiatives to engage in some measure with North Korea. Now, he is advocating this going, or at least on paper, talking about going back at a time when, of course, North Korea is a profoundly different problem than it was under the progressive presidents. It's now this emerging nuclear weapon state. It makes all kinds of threats against the region. Not that it's new for North Korea to make threats, but under Kim Jong-un, we're really seeing the North headed in a very, very dangerous course, and this has provoked many reactions. But is it really realistic that that Moon can reorient the policy and shift it back to what was pursued so vigorously under previous progressive candidates?
Well, you're right. Mr. Moon is a committed sunshine policy supporter. In fact, he specifically made that clear in the North Korea policy statement that he issued a couple of weeks ago. It was the first time that he really had issued a detailed outline of his North Korea policy. And so he's talked about doing a lot of the things that were done under Presidents Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun. You're also right that the situation has changed a great deal over the past 10 years, and that North Korea has moved on, tested several nuclear devices, long-range missiles. There are all sorts of United Nations resolutions. Simply saying, okay, well, I'm going to reopen Kaesong and reopen the Kumgangsan Resort and things like that. He can't do that, and of course he won't because he can't. But clearly he would like to be able to get into a position to do that. And so what is he going to have to do? Well, one of the important factors will be persuading President Trump to adjust U.S. policy to allow at least some measure of those kinds of steps. In that, he will have an advocate in China, because many of the things he is advocating are very similar to the Chinese government's position.
Yeah, it's interesting that he has defined his advocacy of this different course very much in terms of an understandable sentiment to re-elevate the role of Korea on questions related to the future of the Korean Peninsula. As you know very well, you wrote about it, of course, in your book, Koreans often have a sense of being victims of great power manipulation. And under this protracted period, this remarkable period where the ROK only had an acting president and where the state was, I don't want to call it headless, but it was, unclear what was going to happen and when. And so he, in effect, is trying to stake a claim to saying there needs to be a Korean voice that is much more visible and much more active, trying to put Korea much more at the center of these policy determination, which, at one level is wholly understandable because it is, after all, the Korean Peninsula. But it's at a point where Korea now occupies an extraordinarily central part, or at least North Korea does, in U.S. policy deliberations, and many of them, of course, spilling over to other kinds of issues, relations between the U.S. and China, and so forth. So he's trying to have a Korean voice in that process, but he's also emphasizing several other factors. Number one, he claims to have been misunderstood, and that his goal would be first and foremost to meet with President Trump to reestablish a more normal working relationship between the American president and the Korean president, because that's been largely absent simply because there has been no Korean president for some months.
Yes, Mr. Moon does want to lead South Korea in terms of the international community dealing with North Korea. But in fact, President Park also wanted to and exercised a great deal of influence on North Korea policy. It wasn't just President Park doing just what the United States instructed her to do. This was very much her view of how North Korea needed to be dealt with. So she was the one who took the initiative, for example, to close the Kaesong Industrial Park as a part of the effort to increase pressure on North Korea to do the right thing. So the problem now is that Mr. Moon's view is that pressures alone will not work. But I don't think I'm being too cynical or skeptical when I say that I believe that in his heart of heart, Mr. Moon would prefer to minimize as much as possible sanctions and maximize as much as possible inducements to North Korea. The problem with that from a United States perspective, or the perspective, I guess, of most Americans, is that the timeline for the results that one would get from that, if one got results in terms of North Korea being less threatening and so forth, would not be evident soon enough to stop North Korea from developing a full-fledged nuclear weapons program capable of striking the United States homeland with nuclear weapons.
Well, this, of course, creates the possibility of major cleavages between the United States and the Republic of Korea, which, if I were to put myself in the shoes of Kim Jong-un, that would be most beneficial because it creates political space and maybe even economic space for the North, which presently it lacks, given that there seems to be much more cohesiveness in terms of international opposition to what North Korea has been undertaking with respect to its nuclear and missile activity, even to some extent from China, although China has interests of its own here that obviously, ironically, do align China more with the priorities of Mr. Moon. The immediate issue, of course, presumably will be Moon's deliberations over the fate of the theater high altitude, I'm trying to remember all the acronyms, let's just call it THAAD so you don't, it doesn't come trippingly off the tongue. But this, of course, is the U.S. missile defense system that has been very hurriedly introduced and is now operationally deployed in some measure. Moon insists that this was done with far too much haste and without adequate deliberation, and all along has said that this should be a determination for the new president to make. But this could inject severe strain in the U.S.-Korea relationship. I know he's claiming that his policy goals and President Trump's policy goals are closely aligned, but that's in this area, it looks like a forced argument to me, at least.
Yes, the THAAD is actually one of the only two security issues that figured prominently in the campaign debates here. The other was whether Mr. Moon had been truthful in saying that he did not ask North Korea's permission, in effect, for South Korea to vote against its human rights situation 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. So THAAD is a very big issue, and in part because the Chinese are quite blatantly punishing South Korea for not stopping the American deployment of a THAAD unit to protect American forces so they can better defend South Korea and deter the North Koreans. Yeah. There's been a great deal of economic suffering on the part of quite a few businesses and people in South Korea because of this.
Could we say, though, in that context, that let's say that China's popularity in South Korea has diminished very significantly because of these policies? Is that something that somehow Moon can be, if he seeks some kind of a more explicit accommodation or adjustment, if you will, to Chinese concerns, would that turn public opinion as well, or does he run a risk there if he runs against the grain of public sentiment?
It's extraordinarily complicated. Until recently, South Korean public opinion was quite critical of the Chinese punishment. But then President Trump started making all sorts of statements about redoing our free trade agreement with South Korea, and especially said that South Korea should pay $1 billion for the THAAD unit we've deployed here. Which has totally changed the focus of South Koreans away from China and toward the United States. And this is congruent with Mr. Moon's own personal views, I believe. I'm quite confident that Mr. Moon and the people around him really never wanted to have a THAAD deployment in the United States because they want Chinese support and for their views, for their policies toward North Korea, and knew that the Chinese would react more or less like this. But now the unit is already deployed, and whatever Mr. Moon's personal preferences, he knows that trying to overturn that deployment is probably a bridge too far. Mm-hmm. So he's going to have to figure out a strategy for dealing with this issue in a way that does not completely turn off the Americans, while proving to the Chinese that he's done the best he can, and also proving that to his own supporters that he's done the best he can. I think my guess is that what will happen is, in effect, that the THAAD deployment will be maintained, but Mr. Moon, President Moon, will make it clear there's never going to be another such deployment without his express permission, which he will not intend to give. And the Chinese, he will get that message to the Chinese, and that will be the way it will be settled.
One other issue we haven't talked about, and maybe we can briefly discuss, of course, are relations with Japan. I was very struck in looking at the platforms of all the candidates. On this, all the candidates seem to agree. As we know, late in her presidency, President Park sought a series of agreements with Japan. I mean, her relations with Prime Minister Abe had been poisonous in the extreme, but whether derivative of growing concerns she had about China or about worries about North Korea, she ultimately entered into agreements with the Japanese government related both to some intelligence cooperation, the so-called JSOMIA agreement, at the same time trying one more time to resolve the comfort woman issue, so-called. Japan believed or argued that they thought they had come to a final understanding with South Korea, that this issue would not be reopened one more time. There were some financial agreements stipulated, a lot of symbolism related to that. But in the meantime, there are these now two statues, for all I know there are more than two, that are in place in prominent locations in the Republic of Korea, about which the Japanese take great offense. As we know, Japan withdrew their ambassador. He was absent from South Korea for significant period of time. So you have this sense that this incredibly fraught relationship between the Republic of Korea and Japan is not going to get any better. And it raises yet again this issue of how these two very important allies of the United States might be decidedly on cross purposes, which there too as well, that will also be a gift to North Korea. If this persists. I wonder if you could speak at all to your own sense of what could shape this kind of a relationship, which does seem to me, as the North Korean threat increases, there's a logic for increasing cooperation with Japan rather than decreasing it.
Yes, there certainly is. During the campaign, all five of the major candidates did, in fact, indicate that they wanted to renegotiate or overturn that Japan-Korea agreement on the so-called comfort women. I suspect that two or maybe even three of the candidates, if they had their druthers, might have not been as hard on that. But once the Japan issue becomes an issue in South Korea, or the more it becomes an issue, the harder it is for politicians to say, look, we can't think just about the past. We also have to think about the present and the future. Mm-hmm. But, so that's just to underline how political anything involving Japan is in South Korea. I think it's inevitable that or Mr. Moon will push the Japanese on this issue. I think it's even more inevitable that the Japanese now will absolutely not budge on it. The Japanese will say, you've told us, your government, that we had a final agreement on this, and it is final, especially at least under Prime Minister Abe. Mm-hmm. This is, as you point out, a really serious issue for the United States. A significant part of our policy toward North Korea is to put North Korea under increasing pressure, moving towards maximum pressure to try to force North Korea to negotiate sincerely about denuclearization. Part of that is putting more military pressure on North Korea and also increasing deterrence and defense in case the North Koreans do something accidental or crazy. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, Japan is very important. The Obama administration and the Trump administration now have pushed or supported Japan under Prime Minister Abe to do more with the United States and on its own in terms of security in the region. And so this goes straight opposite to what the South Koreans are comfortable with.
Right.
Now, that said, there is a significant percentage of people in South Korea in the establishment and foreign affairs circles who got very uncomfortable with the degree of animosity in the South Korea-Japan relationship for the very reasons that you mentioned. Countries that share largely similar values, similar strategic interests, are both allies of the United States. But again, the politics here tends to overwhelm these things.
Yeah. I dare say, to the degree that there are renewed or increasing strains between Korea and Japan, the Chinese will be cheering not so quietly from the sidelines, which is yet again the incongruity, if you will, from the point of view of the interests, the overlapping of interests between Korea and Japan, that they seem unable, irrespective of the coloration of their political leadership, to find a way on a sustained basis to heal these enormous and legitimate historical divides between the two.
You're absolutely right.
David, two final questions, if I could. When President Park was under mounting pressure, the issue of constitutional revision emerged in South Korea. It has, so far as I could tell, did not play a major role in the presidential campaign itself, but it seemed to me that Mr. Moon seemed much more cautious about this, much less inclined to restrict the extraordinary powers that the Korean president does possess under the Constitution. And any sense at all of how he might proceed is, now that he's going to be president, is he going to even more say he'd like to hold on to the power that he has in terms of the Constitution?
Well, to be fair to him, I think that many of the people who were advocating constitutional revision during the past few months in particular were hoping to use it as a tool to try to prevent him from becoming president through having the revision first and then having the election, which might make it possible to realign, to cause a political party realignment in South Korea. That was tried, I think, and clearly got no traction. Mr. Moon's own position was, I like the idea of constitutional reform, of reducing the powers of the presidency, changing terms. These are various ideas that have been kicking around for decades. But first we need to have the election, because it's just not practical to try to revise the Constitution, which is very difficult, very time consuming, and we might not even be able to do it before we have this presidential election. So that was a powerful, I mean, just on its merits, that was a powerful argument. He clearly won the day. His mentor, President Roh Moo-hyun, was a powerful critic of the institutional, of the imperial presidency in South Korea. And to his credit, did take a number of steps, both symbolic and substantive, to try to change that. Ultimately, it was not enough to fundamentally change the situation. I myself do not know how Mr. Moon genuinely, in his heart of heart, feels about this issue. But he will come under some pressure for a constitutional revision. And if we're spinning out a scenario, I can imagine that it might come out in the context of his effort to get support in the National Assembly necessary to pass his own agenda.
Very, very interesting. One last question, if I could, David. Your book, from which I learned so much, the last chapter in discussing anti-Americanism as this really wrenching factor in our relations at a previous time, much of it under the Roh Moo-hyun presidency, was that anti-Americanism was forgotten but not gone. And do you see a risk that in this circumstance of so much churn, so much uncertainty in geopolitics, so much attention to Korea, coming from the Trump administration, that is, attention to North Korea, do you see a risk that this might yet again be a factor in our relations I appreciate your thoughts.
I am somewhat concerned about a possible new surge in anti-American feeling in South Korea for two basic reasons. One is just as when President Kim Dae-jung became president in 1998, this was a first then in South Korea, but it empowered voices on the left, particularly voices in the media and left-wing NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And at the time, they went with a vengeance after the United States, especially U.S. forces Korea. Now, I guess lightning does strike twice, but in this case, I think that was kind of a perfect storm. Mm-hmm. And I think there will be some NGOs and some media who try to go after USFK again, but I'm doubtful that it will get nearly as much traction as it did 15 years ago. But what I'm more concerned about now is that if President Trump and President Moon are not able to find strong areas of compromise and agreement about their North Korea policy, that the relationship between the two presidents will be very difficult. And I can well imagine President Moon in that circumstance being both publicly and privately to other world leaders critical of the United States and of Trump, and that in turn causing further a vicious cycle in their relationship, and that Koreans, even if they don't particularly like their president, if foreigners are attacking him, especially the United States, that raises hackles. And so I could see this becoming quite nasty. Now, that's just one worst case scenario, and I certainly am not predicting it, but I think a great deal of care needs to be taken on the part of both countries. I'm particularly concerned about President Trump because, in all frankness, he has been appallingly ignorant and incompetent in the way he has dealt with the Korean Peninsula problem writ large. I'm not as critical of his North Korea policy so far because I believe it's largely an extension of President Obama's policy with a little more rhetorical emphasis, which I thought was basically the right approach given how bad all of the other options are. But if you look at the totality of President Trump's dealing with the Korean Peninsula, when you also include how he's dealing with Japan and China in regard to the Korean Peninsula, he's done a very bad job. He needs to get his act together.
David, that's a very appropriate and somewhat sobering conclusion to end on. I think it's safe to say that we have entered an extraordinary period, not only in the political life of the Republic of Korea, but in Northeast Asia as a whole and in the U.S.-Korean relationship as a whole. And I deeply appreciate all of us do your insights today. I am sure there is going to be much to discuss in coming weeks and months. And thank you so much being so generous and staying up late for us in Seoul tonight. So thanks so much, David. Delighted. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.